Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Commercial Leasing Workshop, co-hosted by the City of Boston, Economic Opportunity and Inclusion, and the City and Graffito team. So I think before we start, I really want to start off by saying thank you for being here after a long weekend. I know that wasn't easy, but I want to start off by commending the small business owners. I think it's really challenging and sometimes very intimidating to pursue a retail location, especially if you've never done it before. We've had the opportunity of helping a lot of small businesses, and we hope that after today we can do that for you too. But we've been on the other side of it, and we know that if you have the right resources and the right team behind you, you can successfully open your own retail location, and that's what we hope to do today. And I don't know if there's any space grant recipients in the audience. Any? Congratulations. I heard that application was very long and rigorous, so congrats to you for getting those grant dollars. Hopefully we know that by the end of today, those dollars are going to go to an awesome location in the future. Great. So who is Graffito and what do we actually do? So I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we do, but really more of the reason why we're here today. At our core, we're a Boston-based retail real estate and advisory firm at the intersection of retail leasing, master planning, and branding. And I'd say over the last 15 years that we've been in existence, we've had an opportunity to work with a lot of developers, institutional landlords in the area, planning and leasing valuable ground floor spaces at a neighborhood scale, right? So what does that actually mean? So to give you a few examples, I don't know if anybody lives in Mattapan, but we just recently opened a Daily Table, a grocery store in Mattapan that really kind of speaks to the neighborhood and the people that speak there, right? We've also opened up a concert venue hall in Boston Landing, Roadrunner. I don't know if anybody's had an opportunity to go there. But again, trying to bring retail concepts that actually make sense to the people that live in those neighborhoods. And really, I think over the years, what we've learned is that the work that we do is extremely challenging. It takes a really long time. And we've evolved as a company in serving, the community that we love by being translators, right? Oftentimes what we find is that landlords and small business owners don't necessarily speak the same language, right? So we're the people that come in to make sure that, one, everybody's speaking the same language, and two, can we all understand each other for the common goal that we all have in mind? If that's a retail location or planning thoughtfully what a neighborhood should look like, then we are your partners in doing that for you. And I think we're constantly, as a team, always asking ourselves, well, how can we leverage the social power of commercial real estate to continue to push that equity agenda that we so deeply care about? And then collectively as a team, I'd say the last 2 to 3 years, we really started putting our heads together. Okay, what can we do to really support the small business ecosystem and the community of entrepreneurs that we so deeply respect? So we took all of our expertise and kind of packaged it up in what we're calling the Small Business Toolkit. So the Small Business Toolkit includes the Tenant Road Map that you have in your hand. And we really created these resources with an equity lens in mind. So me trying to put myself in the shoes of a first-time operator who's never approached a retail leasing process, who maybe hasn't had access to expert resources or a robust network, right? Because if we're being honest with each other, we know that this particular industry at its core lives with systemic racism and a lot of discrimination. So how can we break down those barriers by giving you the resources that you need to succeed? And that's what we hope to do today. I want to ground today's workshop in an overall goal and intention, and that is that you leave here today feeling a bit more informed, a bit more prepared to really tackle this process at whatever stage that you may be in. How does that sound? Okay. So the Tenant Road Map to Retail Leasing, it's really a step-by-step guide that we've created for small businesses who've never done this before. That really addresses common challenges, helpful tips, and really that we're including here all the actions you need to take in order to open your own brick-and-mortar location on your own. The document that you have in your hand has about 8 chapters. With the interest of time, we're not going to go through all of it, but just to kind of give you a sense of what's actually in there. Starting from phase 1, which is our planning and pre-outreach section, that's really us trying to put you in the mindset of, okay, I'm ready to open my brick and mortar location. How do I get organized? How do I get prepared? You know, I'm sure you've heard, well, you need a concept deck. Like, you need to be able to present your business to a landlord in a thoughtful way. So we actually outline each single slide that you need in there in order to put that presentation together and put your best foot forward, right? So all the way from planning to pre-outreach to the pre-opening and opening. So getting your physical space ready, you know, working very closely with your contractor, hitting that punch list, figuring out like who do you need to hire for staffing so that you have a successful soft opening. All that information is included in there. But I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jesse, our president and CEO, who's going to kick us off, I think at phase 3, Jesse, during the touring and vetting of real estate opportunities. And we'll kind of kick it off there. Cool? Sweet.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Melissa. Yeah. A couple of just quick preliminary remarks to piggyback on what Melissa was saying. How we found ourselves at this place of putting together this toolkit was largely about how do we, and she used the word translate, how do we continue to translate between small, local, owner-operated businesses and many of the large landlords that exist in Boston, or maybe even small landlords in Boston that just don't speak that same language. And for us, it felt like if we, working very much on the landlord side, could work with tenants that were better prepared to transact, i.e. better prepared to enter a lease or go forward with an LOI, that would really kind of bring down the barriers of entry for everybody and create, knowing that time is valuable, a much more streamlined, ideally, process for both the landlord and the tenant. And that's kind of how we got here. And as Melissa said, we're gonna skip over some of the planning and pre-outreach, encourage you all to kind of use the toolkit, and those of you watching at home to check out that, you may have it up on your desktop now, to check out the part about the concept deck and the pre-planning. But essentially, we're gonna dive right in. Dave and I are gonna walk you through what we think are some of the key things to be thinking about as you go out to lease either your first or second or third space, recognizing that some of you are here who have done this before and some of you haven't. So as I was walking around the room, you know, I asked this kind of fundamental question to many of you that may already have brick and mortar locations, which was like, all right, like what kind of real estate is it? And that may seem like kind of an odd question to ask first, but what we've learned in our experience is that the kind of real estate, sorry, the glare's tough here. The kind of real estate that you house your business in really will impact a bunch of key and critical threshold issues for operating your business. So depending on your business, we'll talk about use a little bit, the kind of real estate you go into really matters, right? So as an example, thinking about things like loading, or do your customers need parking? Or if you're cooking, do you have the mechanicals, the electrical, the plumbing to facilitate that? That is all really critical stuff that we actually think needs to be thought about before you go out and search for real estate. Or if you're saying, hey, you know, it might work really great for me to be in a small one-story building versus being in a large mixed-use building. We say mixed use, meaning a building that's got retail on the ground floor and then other uses above, whether, you know, it's office or residential, or increasingly we're seeing lab in the Boston market. Before I actually leave this slide, one of the reasons we show this slide, this is Allston, a neighborhood of Boston, and you can see within this slide, there are a whole bunch of different kinds of real estate, right? On the bottom right, you see a mixed-use building. It's got a couple hundred apartments above it, and then retail on the ground floor. In the lower left, it's got a nice tree canopy, because when we shot this picture, that's the Speedway, actually where we met Jada, which has 7 small format, 200 square foot boxes with a shared courtyard, right? Very different kind of real estate than the building directly across the street. And very different kinds of considerations as you're all thinking about the kind of real estate you need to open. And once you go up the street, this is Western Avenue, you know, this particular urban context, there are so many different kinds of buildings. So again, you want to be thinking about the kind of real estate. And the other thing that we believe is also really critical, that we see so many tenants miss, and they don't realize it till they're either about to sign the lease or negotiating an LOI, is what kind of landlord owns the real estate I'm looking at, right? And depending on the kind of landlord, particularly in a city like Boston, where you have a lot of universities, nonprofits, larger institutional investors, which by the way, may not be based in Boston. Many of the landlords in Boston don't necessarily live in the communities you want to put your business into. That says something about the negotiation, right? For sure. And some of us have lived that. versus a mom and pop type landlord, a local investor who actually has a business in that neighborhood or lives in that neighborhood, versus an owner, a Matt, we were talking before, versus an owner operator, somebody who's actually operated a business in the space that they now own, right? And may at one point go out there and find a tenant for their own building. So understanding who the actual landlord is and recognizing that in any given neighborhood in Boston, you may have a huge handful of different landlords with very different interests, right? And the other thing we think a lot about, and we're gonna talk about, and Dave's gonna kind of outline rent, which is a biggie. We're gonna spend a lot of time talking about rent and what goes into it, and how many different ways there are to even talk about one singular, you would think easy concept, but it's not. We've found in many of our projects that those landlords that are willing to be more aggressive on rent, right, are those landlords that actually have more scale, right? So as an example, if you're one individual landlord with one building, and let's say you as the landlord have debt on that building, you needed to get a loan to actually buy that building, and you need to pay the bank X amount of dollars, right? And your income comes from the rent you get there, you may have less wiggle room than someone, like in this last slide, bottom right corner, who has 200 units of apartments above, and realizes that if I bring in a really great local tenant, maybe, actually quite likely, people will want to live in this building, and maybe I can be more aggressive with the rent I offer. So when you think about a mixed-use developer versus a mom and pop local investor, there are many different strings that can be pulled. And I think that's true when you're thinking about whether or not, Tony, we were talking about nonprofit landlords have different interests at times. And so do universities. So we're gonna really push all of you listening today to think about the real estate. What kind of real estate do you wanna house your business in, and what are the needs from that real estate before you go out and look for that space? And secondarily, once you start thinking about the range of different real estate, who is the landlord, right? I'll pass over to Dave in a second, but one of the questions I found myself asking this morning was, who's your landlord, right? Like, that actually matters. It matters, your partner. And if you're signing a 10-year lease, this is something we've seen coming through the pandemic, the kind of landlord that is, the way they think about business, what their values are, unfortunately softer, sometimes intangible things, harder to flesh out. But I can assure you, if you look at the way landlords dealt with the last 4 years since the start of the pandemic and their current tenants, that will probably tell you a lot about how they might deal with the next 5 or 10 years with their current tenants. So again, from our perspective, think about the real estate, think about the landlord, really, really critical, foundational elements. Okay, so now we're gonna talk a little bit about, Dave's gonna kind of shepherd you through this, how to build your team. And again, this is before you get to the LOI, we'll talk about the LOI. This is before you get to negotiating terms. We really encourage tenants to think about who are their allies, who's on their team, who can they call when they have a question. Dave?
Thanks, Jesse. Good morning, Dave Downing. I run the leasing practice at Graffito. And I think a lot about the teams that are being built and the folks that are coming to us saying, I have this idea, I have this concept, I put together my concept deck, my plan, I've got a little bit of funding, like, where do I go? And we always say, well, in that concept deck, are you making it clear who's on your team? Business is really a team sport. You may be, as the sole proprietor, have the idea or the vision, but it's really a whole host of people who are going to help make that come to fruition. We always start with, if you're starting to network, starting to get out there and understand, I own a restaurant, okay, I'm going to go to restaurant networking events, I'm going to meet other business owners in neighborhoods I want to be in. Like, who are some of those industry allies, we would call them? Who are those folks that are already doing this or are further ahead in this process than I am, that I could, whether it's a mentor or whether it's somebody who's just a partner in thinking partner, a thought partner, like, that's an important element to have on your team. Someone you can run by, ideas that you have that has already been through that process, right? So starting with that is like, who's in your industry that you can kind of latch onto and learn from. The second is, as you're building out a team, it's, you might open a storefront, but it's not just you probably there every day. You may have other key team members who come on very early in the process. That may be somebody who's just working, the counter and doing checkout, but it also is probably somebody who's been thoughtful in that process with you to get to this point of where am I headed with this business? What are the next steps? How do I actually physically get this space open? So usually we're seeing it's not just one person coming to us. they usually say, hey, I have a chef who's going to come with me, or I have a friend who wants to come with me. Maybe that's an industry ally. So thinking about those key team members early on in this process, even though it's a real estate search, having other people's opinions is really pretty important. These are maybe less important, but other professionals that you are going to need along the way. Things like an insurance provider, it may seem trivial, but at the same point, you're going to get a lease that's going to say, here are your insurance requirements, here's what you need to carry for insurance. And you're going to need somebody to review that, right? And if you want to stay on course and be thoughtful about how this process goes, having some of these folks that you're engaged with early, whether it's a bookkeeper, an accountant, other people who are going to help you through that process, just starting to line those people up. This is the one that probably gets a lot of feedback from first-time kind of folks looking for real estate, is a broker. Do I need to pay a broker? You should not be paying the broker as a tenant looking for space. This usually falls to the landlord to pay that brokerage fee. So don't be shy in reaching out to a broker who probably does this on a day-to-day basis, knows the markets you're going to be looking in, can be a real resource, and you really should not be compensating that broker. I would find another broker if somebody's telling you they need to be compensated. So use brokers if you feel comfortable doing so. What we find is that people are really busy, whether you're in an incubator kitchen and you're in there making the product every day. It's really hard for you to be out there looking for real estate, right? You can call a sign. You can do your own outreach and your own canvassing, we call it. But it's really difficult to be running your business and also having to find as many quality leads as you can. And brokers usually, and you would hope a broker that's more experienced knows the questions to ask. Can I exhaust this space if it's for a restaurant? Is there a grease trap, right? Can I do outdoor dining here? These are all questions that you're going to want to ask. And so it's really business specific, but it's also market specific. So brokers really should be a resource for you if you feel comfortable using a broker. And we are brokers, so I'm saying that and thoughtfully, is that we do go through this in the roadmap, that there's ways to go use a broker and there's ways not to use a broker. So feel free to look back to the roadmap for additional kind of thoughts around that. Architect, a lot of folks may not know this. Typically, you're going to need an architect and an engineer, especially if you walk into a space that we'll get into a little bit later, but is kind of shell condition. There's really nothing in the space. You're going to need an architect and likely an engineer. Architects typically will manage the engineer for you. And that's things, the engineer is going to think about your mechanicals, your electrical, your plumbing, all those fun things that are kind of behind the scenes. And then your architect really is going to be that shepherd. And we use architects a lot. We refer a lot of architects, partly because they're going to help somebody conceptualize things like, how much space do I need, right? How might I lay this space out if it's a weird shape? Being thoughtful about things you may not think about, like, do I need a reception area? How many bathrooms do I need? So if you can find an architect, and we do have this resource list on our website as well, that can actually help you think through some of these kind of intangibles about the space before you actually go out and canvas for space, and while you're in that process, that'll be super helpful if you find something you really like, right? And they'll be able to take floor plans that are really just, they might show just a box like we're in today, and they may be able to help you kind of bring that to life. Architects typically will do a little bit of work up front for free, but expect you're going to have to probably pay an architect at some point, particularly as you get into what we call pre-construction and they start doing more work for you. So just be thoughtful about their time. Some of them will do upfront work on a limited basis for nothing. The other piece of that is a contractor. As you start canvassing more spaces, obviously thinking through, you are going to want somebody who's going to give you some idea of cost, right? If a space really is in that shell condition, it doesn't have mechanicals, it doesn't have bathrooms, there's going to be a real cost to the build out. You're going to have to be thoughtful about somebody coming in and giving you some sense of the existing conditions, which is what's in the space today, and being very clear of, hey, this is what it might take to get you to the next step, right? And that's the cost. And there's always, I would say it always costs more than what somebody tells you, so just be thoughtful about that. I rarely see it come in lower. But that contractor, and there are contractors out there, particularly now as we're seeing kind of work slow, that will be supportive of you in that early stage process. And some of the more established contractors that do retail restaurant contracting, which is really important, I think you really want to be thoughtful about the contractor you're using. It's not somebody who's done a few home renovations. It's somebody who's really worked in some of these commercial buildings you're going to be in, because there's a lot of unforeseen costs that you wouldn't expect that come up, and somebody who's just not well versed in that may struggle with that. And then the attorney, everyone is going to need a good attorney at some point, and a real estate attorney. I stress this because we do see a lot of attorneys that maybe don't have a ton of commercial experience, and it kind of puts you as a tenant at detriment, because the commercial lease is the most important asset you have in your business. If you don't have the physical space and you're running a brick and mortar space, a retail or restaurant shop, if you don't have a lease, you really don't have a business. So you really want an attorney who can protect you and be thoughtful about how they're protecting you, but also not over-lawyer. A lot of these leases, as Jesse was mentioning, maybe come from an institutional landlord. There's just going to be a lot less flexibility there, and attorneys can get bogged down in a lot of the details that really aren't going to change and can cost a lot of money. So I think vetting the attorney, have they been used by one of my industry allies? Have they been used by somebody else that I know? That's always a good way to find an attorney. And then lastly, you are the most important part of this entire process, and it may seem funny to say that, but I think you really are the quarterback of all these professionals and all these industry allies and the folks that you put on your team. And so if things are running behind or they're not going according to schedule, you're going to have to make some decisions, right? You're going to be the one who's really continuing to drive that process. It's great to rely on these professionals, but at the same time, you really want to be the one pushing the process, asking the right questions, and driving it forward. Otherwise, it will kind of lag, and it will be a challenge to kind of go through this process. So just keep that in mind. And typically, if you're going out on a tour and you're looking at multiple spaces, say you're touring with a broker, it's okay to bring somebody along with you, right? You can bring other team members. You could bring an architect with you. You could bring your chef with you. It's okay to bring other people on tours of real estate to help give you kind of other opinions. And it's okay to ask for follow-up information from the broker or the landlord about the space. Can I get floor plans? Can I get existing conditions if you have them? And existing conditions, again, is there bathrooms in the space? What size is the water line? Is there a grease trap? These type of things. So feel free to bring folks with you and ask questions. Always be asking questions. I'm going to turn it back to Jesse just to talk really quickly through kind of key leasing provisions. This is when you find a space, you feel confident, hey, I want to submit a proposal, or I want them to submit a proposal to me, them being the landlord. I want to move to the next step. So, Jesse.
Awesome, Dave. So hopefully you feel a little overwhelmed. I did sitting there. But the truth is, this is hard, right? We've done hundreds of retail leases, and I think one of the key learnings is that those folks that are better prepared and take this process really seriously, it actually translates to them being able to run more viable, sustainable businesses, right? That's what we are really interested in for the urban neighborhoods we work in, is like viability and sustainability, right? How do small local owner-operated businesses go from being 1 or 2 or 3 years to lasting a generation, employing a bunch of people, and then potentially growing equity in that thing where they can transfer the next generation or sell it or actually exit with something, right? And I think what we have also seen is that there's this mad dash and this hustle at the very beginning of trying to get your first retail establishment open that I think is very natural, and some of you have probably been in it. But to the extent that you can think about some of these things before, you're going to be better prepared for success. Forget like signing a lease, like that too, but better prepared generally for success. And that's not something we've seen on a few deals, that is universal. And if this does feel overwhelming, I think we're probably doing our job, because there's a lot that has to be considered, we believe. It doesn't mean there aren't shortcuts, and we can talk about that perhaps afterwards, because there are some. The big one being maybe the space is already built out. Maybe you don't have a lot of upfront operating expenses, or you're entering something that is better set up where it doesn't require as much time. We'll get into that. But again, these are all really critical things. Key leasing provisions. As we were going around the room before talking to some of you, we've got a flower shop, we've got several boutiques, we've got a bakery, we've got a photography studio, and a few more. Those uses impact the way you should be thinking about a lot of these conditions. Whatever you're doing in the space, which we'll talk about, will impact the way you're thinking about particularly the bottom 5 categories here, and we'll go into that. But the first threshold question is, again, who's the landlord? We spoke about that, but who is the tenant? And we say who is the tenant when you sign this agreement. Dave was talking about this legally binding agreement, the actual lease document, which gives you an interest in and a right to real estate. Who's signing it? Is it an individual? Is it a corporation? Is an individual getting a DBA, right? Operating as a business? These are critical questions that you need to answer. Oftentimes for first-time operators, whether or not it is a corporation or an individual, many landlords will say it doesn't really matter because that corporation has no value, right? And that's where, once you start talking about the entity on the tenant side, you start to grapple with questions around security deposit and guarantees. Something I'm convinced that most of you have been out there looking for a lease or signed a lease have had to have a conversation with your landlord or a broker about a security deposit or a guarantee. So we're going to start with security deposit. We're going to talk about guarantee, but think about how these are linked with who the tenant entity is. If you are signing a lease and, for example, you've been operating for 10 years, and actually have some equity, some value in your business, you might say, hey, this LLC, this entity is signing the lease. Why do you need an additional security deposit, right? I'm liable for it. Why do you need additional guarantee? But if you're just starting and that LLC or that corporation or that doing business as doesn't have any value, which I think is probably the case for many of you, this will become really really important to kind of understand and go over. So on the security deposit should be negotiated, right? Unlike the residential context where the standard is first, last security or whatever it may be that many landlords push for, whether or not they get it or not. In the commercial context, we don't typically see a norm, right? And unfortunately, to Melissa's earlier point about systemic racism, one of the things we're seeing oftentimes is those landlords that for whatever reason, biases or otherwise, and for reasons having to do with kind of where they come from, we are oftentimes seeing in the urban context that they are trying to charge more security deposit or ask for more from those entrepreneurs who haven't operated before, who look different, who are from a different socioeconomic class from the landlord. And you really have to be your own advocate here. And this is one of these areas where, to Dave's point, having allies on your team, understanding what is market and what is the norm is of critical importance. And we think, the amount can be negotiated, whether or not it burns down, meaning, let's say the only way to get into a space that landlord says, look, I need 3 months security deposit. You've never done this before. And I've got this handful of other folks that are vying for the space. You might say, you're right, I've never done this before. I'm going to sign a 5-year lease. But if I'm here for 2 years and I pay my rent on time every time, and my business is sustainable, that cash, that 3 months or whatever it may be, is really important for me to operate viably. Give it back to me after 2 years. Give it back to me, right? So all of these things can be negotiated, and we've found that oftentimes they are not, particularly by first-time operators. So think critically about security deposit. The timing of the return is another one. When do you get it back? I mean, most typically, whether it's a letter of credit or cash, right? Regardless, it requires you have that money on hand, and it's oftentimes significant amount of money. You want to be concerned with when you get it back and when you can use it for your next business or paying your staff or whatever it is. I mentioned here cash or letter of credit. A letter of credit is essentially an economic instrument that you'll get from a bank that says at the landlord's demand, they can draw down on this letter of credit. So it functions almost like cash for the landlord. Upon a default, they can get access to that money, they can draw it down, and they can make themselves whole, meaning for whatever reason you're in default, they can apply the money they get from that letter of credit towards the default. A letter of credit these days, it was different 10 years ago, requires you have that amount of money in the bank. No bank is going to give you a letter of credit typically, it's unlikely a bank will give you a letter of credit unless you have cash in the bank. So we think about it for small businesses as really very similar to cash. And then lastly, we think the security deposit needs to be considered in context with what you are putting into the deal. And when I say what you are putting into the deal, to Dave's earlier point, if you sign a lease for a space that all it has is a bathroom and some life safety, but you're going to put in a few $100,000 to build it out, to make it work for your bakery or make it work for your escape room, whatever it is, the landlord then says, okay, you're going to put all your money in. I'm just going to deliver you this box. And oh, by the way, I'd like a security deposit from you as well. We think it's a very reasonable argument to say to a landlord, look, I'm putting in a couple $100,000. That's my deposit, right? Like I'm putting in that HVAC. I'm building out, maybe it is that bathroom or maybe it is that kitchen. Like that is your security. When I leave, that lives with you, the landlord. All landlords won't go for this, and they have their own set of reasons why they may say, nice try, we still need the security deposit. If you jump on us, we're going to have 6 months of downtime, or let's say we paid a broker, we want to be made whole. But I think in the context of the negotiation around the security deposit and the guarantee, understanding and having a conversation with the landlord or the broker about what you're bringing to that deal will be really important for negotiating that security deposit. On the flip side, if you're entering a space where you're not putting any money into, and you have an LLC, or you don't have or you have no corporate entity, and you could just walk away from this thing with very little, landlords like say skin in the game, meaning like you put very little of your own assets into the deal, the landlord may say, hey, what's there protecting me in the event that you pick up one night and leave? It's a legitimate argument, right? A more legitimate argument if you put less money into the deal. So we think all these things are worth consideration. Does that resonate with folks as you're thinking about? Good. So there's another way of thinking about a security deposit. And it's an and it's an or, right? It's and or. Many landlords will ask you for a guarantee. At Graffito, the majority of our work is actually working for landlords, trying to bring in businesses like you all, small businesses, into our projects. We, as a matter of practice, rarely ask for personal guarantees. Rarely. That doesn't mean many landlords out there won't ask for a personal guarantee. It is our professional advice and opinion that keeping, even though this doesn't work on a day-to-day basis, your life and your business, they're oftentimes intertwined. But legally and financially, there are many reasons to keep those separate, right? So we would never, and I was practicing law prior to Graffito, and there's a little overlap there. I would advocate super aggressively for my small business clients to never sign a personal guarantee. It didn't always work, but I didn't think they should be putting their own home, if they had one, or their resources to pay their family at risk on a commercial transaction like this. That was my perspective. So then the question is, if you're not willing to provide a personal guarantee, what sort of guarantee can you provide? And for many of you that don't have another corporation that can provide a guarantee, it ends up pushing you right back to the security deposit, right? But there are other ways you can structure personal guarantees and corporate guarantees that protect you, the operator. One of the tools which we see, unfortunately, rarely used, but increasingly so, is just limiting that guarantee, right? You may say to the landlord, I don't have 3 months cash to put in. I have significant personal wealth, but I don't have access to cash. Or not even significant, I have some personal wealth. I'm willing to sign a personal guarantee, but your recourse, your ability to recover under that guarantee is limited to 6 months rent, right? So you can't put 3 months cash down, but you might say, I'm willing to be liable up to 6 months. You can limit both personal and corporate guarantees through documentation in the lease. So all of this stuff is critical and is stuff that we think a lot about. And I spent a lot of time on this because I think it is really important. And we see so many small businesses not even think about it, sign a personal guarantee, sign a lease with their own name, and further downstream, there are ramifications of that. So I'm going to quickly go through permitted use, and then I'm going to pass it over to Dave to talk about the premise. So permitted use, this is an interesting one because many of you here who I spoke to before, you don't just have one singular use. You're looking to do more than one thing in the space. Whether or not it's a floral shop that does workshops, whether or not it's a bakery with classes, whether or not it's a boutique that also sells women's clothing and yarn and custom clothing, right? In the lease document, and again, these are things that we believe should be negotiated before they go into the lease, right? You should be talking to your landlord on day one about this, or the broker. In a lease document, there's going to be a section that says permitted use. Simply, what are you allowed to do in the space? Sometimes it will be super broad, wine and liquor shop, right? Sometimes it will be as detailed as the following. Gourmet foods and wine shop, also selling beer and liquor, open 7 days per week. Tenant may provide wine and beer or liquor tastings on an incidental basis, to be further defined in the lease, right? Remember, this is going to the LOI. But otherwise, tenant will sell wine, beer, and liquor for off-premise consumption only. No cooking or food will be permitted in the premises. This is from one of the deals that Dave did a few years ago. Very specific. And what's really interesting to think about is that as a tenant, if it just says wine and liquor shop, there's way more gray area. You could argue you can do more. A landlord's going to want to be very specific. That's 1B. And you're going to want to be very specific as well to make sure that all the things you want to do, wine and liquor shop, well, what if you want to sell food? Those are the kind of things that should go in the use. That dictates what you can do in the space. We gave a couple other examples here for a daycare center and a full-service restaurant where we think it's in both the landlord and tenant's best interest to define the use as carefully as possible. Landlords typically want it to be as narrow as possible. Tenants oftentimes want it to be as broad as possible to allow them to pivot and do as much as they possibly can. We also recognize in the context of retail real estate and just retail generally, things are changing really quickly. The world is changing really quickly. And if you're signing a 10-year lease, what you're doing today precisely, it may be really different in 5 years or 8 years or 9 years. How do you look at the permitted use provision to give you that flexibility? Critically important. And again, just to close out this section, and I'll hand it over to Dave, one of the reasons, we're not talking about the actual lease right now. These key provisions, just going back 2 slides, these 7 are things that we believe you should be speaking with those advocates on your team, the broker or the landlord about before you spend all the time and energy negotiating a lease. We think these are all of critical importance and again, should be discussed prior to reviewing that lease document. And if you haven't done that yet, make sure you think really carefully about these in particular because they affect what you can do in this space. They'll affect cost and they'll affect timing. So with that, I'm going to kick it to Dave to talk about the premises.
Jesse, I would just add that everybody has a copy of a sample LOI in their pamphlet. So if you want to take a look at that when you have time.
And one more quick thing is that even if you're not working, Rob, I think you mentioned you were negotiating LOI for your space. Many landlords might say, let's just go right to the lease. And you might say, well, let's just define some of these key things before we go right to the lease. Or a landlord may say, or you may say, let me just document and email to you some of these key provisions before we go to lease. Regardless of the form, whether it's something more formal, to Melissa's point, like this is our form LOI, it may not be this exhaustive, but it may be something that at least details in writing so you enter that transaction being on the same page on some of this stuff.
I'll just add one thing to that. It's worth, when you do get a letter of intent and you do agree on the terms, making sure that goes to the attorney so they know what's been negotiated. Sometimes you will use an attorney in the letter of intent process, but you don't really need the attorney. It's really more, these are business issues that are up to you. You may need some guidance from a broker or an attorney, but really what you're looking for is to kind of memorialize the major terms before you move to a lease and start spending money on an attorney. So the premises, Jesse mentioned this earlier, just, there's no perfect space. There really isn't. And we've seen a lot of spaces. It's kind of like home buying or looking for an apartment. You may find the general area you want to be, but you may have to compromise along the way, right? It may be a little bit smaller than you wanted or a little bit bigger than you wanted, but as long as the economics work and the physical space kind of meets your needs, is pursuing something along those lines. Knowing what's kind of above you, below you, and to the sides is also really important. Just to understand, like to Jesse's point earlier, there's mixed-use buildings, like is there a lab, life sciences, and there's real research going on above me, which may have sound consequences? Is there somebody living above me? So like if I run a spin studio and I'm running a 6 a.m. class, am I going to disturb that resident above me? That's going to have cost implications down the road. So just understanding the physical premises, and that's what we call, that's real estate jargon, but premises is really what, your physical space is called at the end of the day. It's as simple as that. There's certain tenant responsibilities, right? You're going to have the responsibility to pay rent. You're going to have the responsibility a lot of times to pay the real estate taxes on that space, the building insurance on that space, other kind of operating expenses for the building. And we'll get into that a little more when we talk about rent. But definitely really important to understand what your responsibilities are in that lease. You may have certain operating hours that you're required to operate. You may not be able to kind of what we call go dark. You may have to actually continuously operate for those minimum operating hours unless there's notice to the landlord or you come to some other agreement. So just being thoughtful when you do get a lease is understanding and talking with your attorney about what are my responsibilities. And you're going to have rights too, right? You should have access to that space 24/7, right? Unless it states otherwise. You have an actual interest in the real estate. And then there's going to be, things like operations in terms of like loading. Not all spaces are going to have a really good loading situation. So if you run a bakery and you need to do deliveries in the morning, you really need to be thoughtful about, is there a loading dock or some easy way for me to get product in and out of the space? Sometimes in a mixed-use building, you'll have a shared loading dock where you'll be able to store your trash, your recycling. There may even be composting. You may be able to get deliveries through that. So really starting, and this goes to kind of looking what's around me and understanding how the physical space works is really pretty important, including things like utilities, right? What is serving the space? If I'm going to run a restaurant and I do need gas, is there gas to the space? If not, can I look for an electric alternative? And we're seeing more and more spaces actually, buildings really trending that way, especially new construction is a lot of the municipalities are requiring that they're electric only. So that's going to impact operations and how you're using the space. Things like if there's a water line, where's that water line located? Is it in a common area that I'm going to have to pay for to bring that water line over to the space? So there's a lot of thought that goes into it. More than just walking a space is being thoughtful as you walk through that space. Like, what are some of the things I should be considering, right? Does it have good ceiling heights? What's below me? All those things start to play into kind of the importance of understanding physical space and how you as the operator, no matter what business, how you're using that space. There are some nuances too, depending on the permitted use, as Jesse mentioned earlier. In certain situations for like if you're running a daycare, you need to think about pickup drop-off. You need to think about, is there open space nearby where I can bring the kids because that's a state requirement. So all these things, depending on the type of business you're operating, you're going to have a different view of how you interact with that space while you're touring it, whether you're building it out, or whether you're operating that space. There's all these considerations. And typically it's a longer term commitment, right? So you want it to work for you for the long run, and you may need to make modifications over time. Delivery conditions, you heard me mention a few times earlier, just existing conditions. It's as simple as what's in the space, what's there today. This is actually an image of what we call a cold, dark shell, which is there's no heating and cooling. There's only construction lighting, so there's no real lighting. There's basic life safety, which means there's sprinkler heads, but they're turned up. So you're going to have to modify those. A lot of times there's not even an electric panel in the space. There's no bathrooms. There is nothing. So in a situation like this, which is a lot of the product we work on, we call new construction for the most part, that's an expensive build out, right? And so the money's going to have to come from somewhere. It's going to have to come from some from the landlord, probably some from you. And construction costs during the pandemic have only gone up. Things have not gone down. So being thoughtful about your budget and the spaces that you're walking and touring, and understand, is this landlord, and a lot of our institutional clients are willing to put out more money to get the right independent tenants in there than just taking kind of the highest rent check they can get. Vanilla box, that we typically define as, it has heating and cooling. It usually has a bathroom, not always. And it has kind of basic lighting and basic life safety. You'd be surprised how expensive just the heating and cooling element is. So just understanding when you walk into something, and typically a vanilla box you could think of as like an office space that was just wide open, right? I would call this kind of an advanced vanilla box, right? This is almost in finished condition. So just being thoughtful about that as you walk the space. And then there's second generation space, which there was a former use in there, right? If you're going to open a bakery and you're touring a dry cleaning space, a former dry cleaner, you have to be thoughtful about some of the costs that are going to go along with that. Now, if it was a former bakery and you're walking into and they've just taken all the equipment with them, but it was a shell of a bakery before, well, it's probably going to be a little more affordable for you to get into that space quicker, to spend a little bit less money doing it. And so second generation spaces, we're starting to see more and more kind of restaurants turnover, probably as a result of the pandemic and some of the funds that were received during that pandemic, as well as a lot of the competition that's been added in a lot of these neighborhoods over time. So we're seeing more kind of what we call second generation spaces or second generation restaurants coming up, which does make it a little easier if you're a restaurant tour looking to get into a new space.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, question.
So I've had a lot of space grant recipients reach out looking for second generation spaces and they can't find them. What advice would you give to a business owner who's really focused on finding a second generation space?
So I would say half the people reaching out to us are looking for a second generation space, if not more, particularly budget related. So to Melissa's question is, how do I go about finding a second generation space? It ends up going through brokerages, typically, is where those spaces go to first. Sometimes it's a business that's not doing well and is trying to get something, as Jesse was mentioning, to exit with something on the way out to get a sale of the business. A lot of times that's probably how it will take place, is as a sale before it actually comes to what we call the market, the open market, where you could see a sign up or you see a listing from a broker. So typically that's really handled through the commercial brokerages, those second generation spaces or those restaurant spaces. So that's a lot of times how that will work out. So having some contact with brokerages may have its benefits from that standpoint. Timing, this is a big one. I think everyone we talk to, particularly first-time business owners, always hope or think the process is going to be really fast. It's just not. It used to be about a year for new construction. And again, remember, that was with nothing in it, right? I'd say it's probably closer to like a year and a half now, or 16 months for that process to play out. Now, if it's a space that was a second generation space, whether that was an office space or whether that was a restaurant space or whatever it was, those spaces typically turn over a little faster, but it still can take 6 months or more depending on what you're doing. So we've kind of put out a simple timeline here to start thinking about how long the process takes to identify the space. We have 3 to 6 months. That can take a lot longer depending on what you're looking for. It could also be shorter. You might just get lucky. Then there's a negotiation process for the letter of intent and the lease. You have to give yourself some time for that. Negotiating these major terms and actually getting something that's not going to put you in a tough spot can take a little bit of time. We have 2 to 4 months here. We've had leases that go over a year. So there's a lot of variables in how this kind of works out. The architecture and engineering, this is really for new construction. Again, if they need to do a full construction drawings or a full permit set to submit to the city to review to get a permit, that can take 2 to 4 months easily. Permitting can take a month or 2 months, and that you're working close, even if you're working closely with the city. And then the construction process, again, it really depends on your use, what the condition of the space was, and what you're planning to do to the space, right? And we've seen, this range from a month to 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, depending on what you're building out. And that's even with the team we talked about earlier in place, right? This stuff just takes time. And then you got to remember to also set aside some time. You're going to need to train staff. You're going to need to move in kind of furniture, fixtures, other things. You're not going to need a little bit of time. So really building that into kind of what we're going to call this rent commencement date, which is really as simple as when does your rent start, right? So the commencement date is technically when your lease is executed and you have possession of the space. There can be a delay from when you sign a lease to when you actually take possession of the space. And that could be the landlord's doing a little bit of work to prep the space for you. That could be, there's an existing tenant in there and they're moving out. There could be all sorts of reasons why you may not take possession upon lease signing. And then rent commencement, you really want to structure some time between when you take possession of the space to when you actually start paying rent. The ideal situation, and how we structure it in most of our deals from the landlord side, is we really try to build this timeline out and say, from when they sign this lease, how much time are we giving them to get the doors open? Whether you're a retailer or a restaurant, no matter what you're doing, like how much time is it really going to take you? And a lot of times that's a collaborative process with the tenant. Now, if you're looking for your space on your own, you have to be in that mindset. How much time do I need? Is it 6 months I can get the doors open? Then great. Even build in a little buffer if you can. Just realize on the other side of that, it's a landlord not collecting a rent check. And so they're motivated to shorten that period of time, and you're trying to extend that period of time. So the rent commencement date is the date you really, really care about, because that's when you are obligated to start paying rent. Permitting and zoning, Jesse talked about this a little bit. The one thing on this, not all spaces or areas are zoned for your use. So really doing a quick zoning check, and you can use a zoning attorney, or you could just, a lot of times the municipalities will have this in their zoning code. Is my use allowed here? So it's something to spend a little bit of time on. A lot of the brokers, if you use a broker, they should know, or they should be able to find you an answer. But verifying that is really important, because some uses are not permitted in certain areas or in certain spaces. TIA, this just stands for Tenant Improvement Allowance. The reason this is important is, you're going to be spending some of your own money. The landlord's going to be hopefully spending some of their own money to get you into a new long-term lease. That's going to come from the landlord as a tenant improvement allowance. What's important about this topic is a lot of tenants, and we just had this issue come up, is a lot of tenants don't realize that the landlord doesn't just hand you a check, right? A lot of times you have to actually spend the money first, and then they're reimbursing you along the way. So if it's, and a lot of times they may not pay you till the end. Please never agree to that, especially if it's a longer process to build something out. Please make sure you're getting money along the way. Usually it's as frequent as a month. Sometimes we see it every couple months, but never really want to be all your money going in first before the landlord puts some money in. But there is a lag in terms of the reimbursement. So, your contractor is going to be probably billing you every 30 days. They're going to submit a bill to you. You're going to have to package that all up, submit it to the landlord for them to pay you. So, but in the meantime, you're going to have to pay the contractor, right? So there's a period of time when you're kind of spending some of your own money, and we've seen this come up where it's really a cash flow problem. It's not that you don't have the money, it's just you're putting out your money first, and then you're getting reimbursed for it. So make sure you work that out with your contractor and the landlord to really be clear and understanding of that. And then opening, again, we talked about this earlier. It's just setting aside some time where you're not paying rent if you can. You don't really see much time period for this, but at least a couple weeks where you have time to train staff, you have time to get familiar with the space and how it operates. Usually this is kind of like the last piece of it that flies by. But we have this all in the roadmap, so take a look at that. Feel free to ask some questions at the end. I'm going to jump to rent, because this is probably most important to everyone. First and foremost, Jesse mentioned this earlier, rent is negotiable, just like a security deposit. You just have to be, understand a few things. One is, what condition is the space in? Is there a real cost for me to get in here? What's the market like around me? If you go to the seaport, right, it's a lot different. It's going to be much higher cost than if you're going to Lower Roxbury, where we're doing work right now, right? It's a fraction. So it really is market dependent, and landlords are typically looking for market rent, right? And market rent, we say, is really variable. It's block to block, and it really is. If you're on Seaport Boulevard versus A Street, it's going to be a lot different in terms of the cost in the Seaport, for example. So just keep that in mind. It's always negotiable, but there is a certain threshold landlords are looking to achieve from a rent standpoint. So you're only going to have so much flexibility, because there will be other tenants interested in taking that space. But understanding the market and whether you use a broker or not, understanding what some of the comparable rents are in the area is really pretty important. And that'll help you that will help you negotiate. Base rent, we often see it, we list it as kind of this NNN number, which just means triple nets. The triple nets, real estate taxes, operating expenses, which is really like things, common area maintenance, things like window washing or snow plowing. If you're in a mixed-use building, like those are costs that ultimately you get passed back for your proportionate share of the building. So in theory, you're a small piece of the building, but you're still paying your share. And then usually the last net is insurance. So there's building insurance, and you're again paying your kind of pro rata share. So those are what we call NNN. And a lot of times what you're going to see, and we've heard examples of this, is base rent listed as $30 triple net as an example. But what you really care about as a tenant is, is that annual? Is that monthly? Like how am I calculating that number? When we list it as a 30 NNN, we're just meaning on an annual basis, you're paying $30 per square foot, right? But you're also responsible for things like real estate taxes, the CAM, and the insurance. So you as a tenant should understand both the monthly, but what does that equate to as the per square foot on a triple net basis? We've been pushing more and more on our side for gross deals, which means that includes the triple nets. So if the nets were, the example we gave is if the nets were $10 a foot, you have to make sure you're accounting for that in your budget, because really it's a $40 square foot number you're paying, you're responsible for, right? So that's the gross number, that's the all-in number. So it's really $40,000 is what you're responsible for, not $30,000, right? And so it's really important to understand that. We've heard of tenants signing leases where they thought it was a gross lease, but it was a triple net lease, and it was clearly defined in their lease, and it just had not been explained to them. And they were still responsible for paying those triple net costs. So really, really understand what's in the rent number, what's calculated in it. Whether is it a gross number? And when we say modified gross, a lot of times that's gross, that's including the $40,000, but you still are paying utilities. So modified gross or gross, you're typically still paying utilities today. So there's a cost to that, right? Running your lights, running your heating and cooling, just being smart and budgeting money for that is pretty important. So between the base rent, yeah.
So I was always informed never to sign a triple in lease. So you're saying you can sign it, but you have to know exactly what it is before you sign it.
Right. I would say triple net leases. Yeah. The question was, I've been informed to never sign a triple net lease. Triple net leases are kind of the norm in the industry in Boston. So, but the way to hedge that or just understand that better is make sure you know, and the landlord typically will provide you with this, what are those triple net costs? And if they can't be transparent with you and share those numbers, it's probably not a good long-term relationship for you to enter. Because you're going to get yourself into trouble with costs. And we've only seen, again, real estate taxes typically are only going up. The operating expenses are typically only going up. We usually hold like 3% a year. So if it's $10, add 3% to that every year in your budgeting. It can be more, it can be less, but you just have to be mindful that that $10 is also not fixed. That's a variable cost that is typically going to go up. Yeah.
Are you ever seeing tenants try to cap that so they can fix? You follow me?
Yeah. So great question is, and we've seen this more the last couple of years, can tenants ask for a cap on those triple net costs, right? Because you don't want the landlord profiting. You just want the landlord, basically passing back your share, but they're good stewards of, those dollars, particularly on the operating expenses. The real estate taxes, they don't have any control over. But operating expenses, they typically do. So yes, you can ask for a cap, and typically that's going to range between 3% and 5%. A lot of times landlords are reluctant to give that, but you could cap that at 5% typically. And again, you're going to be asking for it. The landlord's not going to offer that up. So, yeah.
Is water and sewage part of the landlord or maintenance responsibility?
So all utilities, unless it's otherwise noted, unless it's otherwise specified, you're going to be responsible for your share. And you could have that sub-metered, you could have to pay direct to the utility. All that needs to be kind of worked out in these conversations. The last thing I'll add is that we do see sometimes, more so with restaurants, we see percentage rent involved. And that's really, if the landlord believes that they're doing maybe a below market deal, or they're putting a lot of money in, they may want to see some upside through percentage rent. And it's not, typically we're going to see that range between, I would say 4 and 6% is typically where we see it end up. There's typically a break point to that. So, maybe the first $1 million you make as a restaurant, you're not paying any percentage rent, right? And then over that $1 million threshold, you're responsible for another 4 to 6 cents of every dollar, right, to the landlord as additional rent. And so it's a little nuanced, and I'm not going to get into more detail than that right now. We can hit it maybe in the Q&A, but it's an important factor that you may see that particularly if you're a restaurant owner, you may see that involved. We've even seen it in retail deals if it's a lower base and then there's a percentage, the landlord's really looking as they're doing you a favor, trying to help out. You just need to be thoughtful about how that's set up. If you're not too concerned about sharing anything over $1 million, then I would say, it's not a bad deal if you can get a lower base rent. So again, it's very nuanced rent. It sounds like a very simple concept, but there's a lot of different elements to it. And you need to protect yourself. You need to just be thoughtful as you go through the process. Yeah, go ahead.
So I just wanted to acknowledge that this was like a really rare occasion, but when I was looking for my store, one of my friends told me that independent landlords are more likely to negotiate a triple net lease. And I kind of just walked away from the space that I wanted for the first time because it was a triple net lease and the landlord ended up taking it. So it was a very rare occasion. I did not expect that to happen, but it did happen, and so it is possible. But I feel like that was more because it was an independent landlord and not like a big company kind of real estate company.
Yeah, so the question was, I walked away from a triple net lease, right? I wouldn't be scared about a triple net lease. I would be more, you want to be informed of what's included. What are my responsibilities? What are tenant responsibilities around rent, around the triple nets? Those are the important pieces. Are things like, is trash included in my triple nets? There's a lot of costs that can sneak up on you that are not included in triple nets. Utilities are not included in triple nets.
But the more important part here is he gave in.
Right, he came back to you. Yeah.
I didn't realize he would be willing to. He asked me, why did you walk away? I really thought you were going to go through with it. And I said, I learned what a triple net lease is. I've never signed a triple net lease before, and I just don't like the concept.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay, well, I honestly paid my property off years ago, so if that's what's stopping you, then I'll take it off.
Yeah.
But again, it was probably because he was an independent landlord, and all the other people I contacted that were huge real estate companies didn't even give it a second of thought.
So I missed that piece that you got the space. That's great. So I think that goes back to you can negotiate, right? Everything is technically negotiable. If a landlord feels like this is maybe what gets the right tenant in the space for me, and all landlords have different motivations, a lot of our clients will consider whether it's a fixed triple net number, or which is essentially a gross lease, or they'll consider actually converting it. So I think everything is really negotiable, but you have to have the right questions to ask. And it's great he came back to you. I mean, that is more like an independent landlord thing to do.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to one of the things we spoke about at the very beginning, which is understanding the landlord. What are their needs? It's oftentimes very hard to discern that in a negotiation, but because had you been clear as to why you were leaving and engaged in that conversation, you might have saved some time, but good job nonetheless. And the other thing I would just say, and then I'll hand it to Melissa, is that on all the key leasing provisions we discussed, the fundamental question is who bears the risk in that relationship, right? So JB asked a question about triple net, don't be afraid of signing a triple net lease. Just use that lease document as a way of trying to pass on some of the risk to the landlord so the tenant is not bearing the whole thing. So one way would be, to Dave's point, you cap increases at X%, right? So and you can underwrite and you can plan for your expenses not going up more than X amount. And we've even seen tenants who have more negotiating power say, and Dave mentioned it, normally we don't see real estate taxes capped. Well, maybe if you have a little bit more leverage and you want to really adjust the risk, you advocate for that too. So part of in all these provisions is where's the risk? Who's performing the work? Who's paying for certain things? who actually is taking the risk on things taking too long, which is really hypercritical. And then the other part is these key issues, don't wait till the very end on the lease. Do it up front. Like Dave did a great job walking us through the rent, and there's some nuance there. Like that should be one of the first things you negotiate before you start to go over whether it's a 10 or even 30 page or even 40 page lease document. Get that stuff right and be super clear.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Dave. So I know that was a lot of information, but I just wanted to thank the team, not only Jesse and Dave, but the entire Graffito team that's here. We have Drew and Brooke in the back, as well as Tanya. We've taken a long time to kind of put these resources together. So we're going to conclude this part of the presentation, but really want to open it up for discussion for everyone in the room, and to thank Aaliyah in the back and the City of Boston for their time, energy, and platform for allowing us to do this. We hope that these resources will be helpful for everyone in the future.